Letter of Barnabas, chapter 9, 125 through 130. For the scripture saith, and Abraham circumcised 10, and 8, and 300 men of his household. What then was the knowledge given to him in this? Learn the 18 first, and then the 300. The 10 and the 8 are thus denoted, 10 by I, 8 by H. You have the initials of the name of Jesus. And because the cross was to express the grace of our redemption by the letter T, he says also 300. He signifies, therefore, Jesus by 2 letters and the cross by 1. Okay, so as you know, I think the evidence in the Bible is inconclusive, and the evidence from archaeology is also inconclusive. It could go either way, right? You could have Jesus being executed on a straight up pole or stake or tree with his hands over his head and nailed from the sides, just like we have archaeological evidence showing the feet were placed on each side of the base of the tree or the pole of the stake and nailed from the sides. Or you could have it to where Jesus had his hands out, either on a piece of wood that he brought to an area where there was a tree and they nailed the piece of wood on the tree, or, he was put up on a cross or T-shaped execution form. Look, everybody, it makes no difference to us. I don't see why it would. What would it make a difference? Right? Does it make any difference? It's the Romans who put him to death. If the Romans wanted to use a T-shaped cross, whether it was for Tammuz or not, who cares? What does that have anything to do with us or with Jesus? It doesn't. It doesn't change anything. I don't know why we ever really argue about it other than the fact that we're all trying to figure out what was correct, right? We want to be accurate. And then, of course, Trinitarians and others freak out over torture stake, Stauros in the New World Translation. So they're the ones who attack it and then us by extension. And so we have to defend it. And we're like, well, who cares? Who cares anyway? It is a potential meaning of the term. You just don't agree with it because of your historical adoption of it as part of your tradition and really idolatry, right? You use it in religious veneration all the time. Constantine claimed he was given the sign divinely in a vision, in a dream. So you guys are nuts, right? You guys are using visual things in ways that are nowhere represented in the Bible to us. Now, I will say this. I believe this represents an early piece of evidence that supports the use of a cross or a T-shaped instrument. Right? Once again, we have manuscript authority to the 4th century, 300s. We have pretty good authority early on that ascribes this to the Apostle Barnabas. We do have some issues. So, all right. I actually think you get probably, if you believe Jesus was killed on a cross, I think this is a piece of evidence on your side. I think the letter of Barnabas is something that you could cite as a part of your evidence. Although it goes on to talk about, I think we'll see in the selections that I made, it goes on to talk about something that would contradict that very conclusion. Right? So while if this is written by the Apostle Barnabas, I would give that serious weight, right? If I was sure, and I'm not sure, no one's sure. That's why it's not part of the Bible. And early on was questioned, outside of Clement of Alexandrian origin. If I had more confidence this was written by Barnabas, I would accept that Jesus was put to death on a T or a cross. Again, what's the difference, everybody? Does that change anything for you? Right? You don't, if you're like me, you don't run around wearing and praying to crosses or through using crosses or stakes, right? Most of us don't do that, at least here. I mean, I guess some of us might, but I don't see that it changes anything. The Romans put him to death. They could have used anything they want. Maybe it was a cross, right? But the evidence is not conclusive. And the way Trinitarians and others attack the New World Translation, that's not fair, right? Because it isn't so clear. Now, if we accept the Epistle of Barnabas, I think it gets more clear. Okay, but it's not accepted. I will consider it as definitely a piece of evidence in favor of a T or a cross-shaped instrument. Chapter 12, 161 through 163. In like manner, he points to the cross of Christ. Now, remember, even though it did say cross in terms of the T, this is an English translation, right? So not every word just means cross. But I think following what he just said about the T, there's no problem there. Now hang on, though. He points to the cross of Christ and another prophet who saith, and when shall these things be accomplished? And the Lord saith, when a tree shall be bent down and again rise, and when blood shall flow out of wood. Here again you have an intimation concerning the cross and him who should be crucified. Now, we go to that section in the Hendrickson edition of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, chapter 12, and look and see where that reference is. The reference part where it says, when a tree shall be bent down and again arise, and when blood shall flow out of wood. The reference on page 144, it's kind of tiny. Now, the note is note 19. It says, from some unknown apocryphal book. Okay? So again, here's another example of either the letter of Barnabas quoting a source we don't have, but that they used, which is probably the case, right? I mean, it's not likely that these early sources, or any source, right, would just invent a source. I guess it's possible, but in this context, right, what would it prove? If he couldn't reference something to the people he's writing to, as the Christians did, that was the whole point, right? To be able to say, hey, here it says this, here it says that, and there would be interpretations at times, but basically, the credibility comes from being able to cite the information. So I think there was definitely some source. Now, there's another reference we're going to get to that's kind of a combination that's kind of interesting in light of our pre-Christian evidence. Jesus is the biblical Messiah. But I wanted to share this with you because, there's several other instances like this for both the Latin and the Greek where we're not really sure what's going on. Where they're either what they're quoting or the text itself is a little difficult. So you need to keep that in mind. As I said earlier, right, that you would read some things, if you read this letter, some things you would read and think, well, where's that in the Bible, right? Where's that in any ancient text? Well, we don't know sometimes. Sometimes several, and it's not just once or twice, it's several times some of the quotations appear to be from a source we don't have right now, or a version of, say, the Psalms we don't have representation of. But I believe whoever wrote this did. 12, 172, 176. Moreover, Moses, when he commanded, ye shall not have any graven or molten image for your God, did so that he might reveal a type of Jesus. Moses then makes a brazen serpent and places it upon a beam, and by proclamation assembles the people. When therefore they were come together, they besought Moses that he would offer sacrifice in their behalf and pray for their recovery. And Moses spake unto them, saying, when any one of you is bitten, let him come to the serpent placed on the pole, and let him hope and believe that even though dead, it is able to give him life, and immediately he shall be restored. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the Kearsarge Lake edition. It's the most convenient way to check the Greek text, although you could look at the Codex Sinaiticus online like I showed you earlier. But if we look at chapter 12, I have another section here marked that we're going to get to probably in a moment. Let's go to this one. Chapter 12. And so you can see here what's happening. Right now we're getting the letter of Barnabas referring to the account in the Old Testament where Moses put a serpent on a pole. Now, the way it's described here, right, it says places it upon a beam, not a cross. It's not translated cross like this is translated cross up here. And down here it's translated place the serpent on the pole. Serpent placed on the pole, not cross. So if we accept that both references, right, this one here and this one here about the T and the cross, we accept both of these are original, and whether by Barnabas or not, just original part of the document. How could we harmonize this? Well, I think, as I said earlier, it's possible, right? The New Testament says, and even part of the prophecies involved being hung on a tree, right? The New Testament uses the word for tree, zilon, which can also mean a club, right? Even in the context, like I talk about in one of my cross stake pole videos. So you could have Jesus carrying a pole or an upright instrument, right? A piece of wood big enough to nail on a tree. And so it could be both, right? It could be that just like you have in that context, right? You have zilon used of a club, the club that the people came to arrest him with. They clearly weren't crosses, right? And then, of course, we know the prophecy fulfilled talks about him dying on a tree, which is a zilon. And of course, also stauros is used, which could mean cross or pole. So if both of these are correct, right? If one is not an interpolation and the other one isn't, right, which we're not sure, but they're both in the Latin and Greek texts of the 4th century, then I would say we're dealing with something where Jesus probably carried a piece of wood to Golgotha, and they used it to nail him to a tree, so that he probably was either outstretched or that piece of wood, right? A tree isn't always linear, right? Right? If you find a tree out there, sometimes it might be straight enough, I guess, to nail someone to, like straight up, and have a beam up for their hands. But it may also be that they needed a piece of wood to place behind him. But if the reference to the T is accurate, there would still be the hands placed out, even if they were nailed to the tree, right? Or nailed. No, they wouldn't. For the T to be accurate, I think you would have to have the hands outstretched somehow. So again, it's a big if because this isn't canonical, but it's not to be ignored either. But I think it could be harmonized if we accept both of these references as genuine letter of Barnabas and even apostolic. I think you could have Jesus that carried a piece of wood to Golgotha, nailed to a tree, and who cares if his hands were outstretched or not, right? Why is that such a big deal? That doesn't change anything at all to me. And again, we can't override the New Testament evidence necessarily for a 4th century version of the letter of Barnabas and criticize the New World Translation because of it, right? Just because it may be a good piece of evidence, that's not enough. But let's take a look real quick here. So what does it say in 12:172? Right, so we know the translation here is not cross, where it's talking about how the serpent was put on the pole or beam by Moses. And here, on page 385 of volume 1 of the Apostolic Fathers in the Loeb Classical Library edition, he says, So they came together, and it's a little bit different translation. In this case, where it says here, serpent placed on the pole, in what I believe is the Ante-Nicene Fathers edition. In the Loeb Classical Library edition, it says, the serpent placed upon the tree. And the word is Zilon. Epiton often ton epitu zilu. So that word is tree right there, Zilon, for the serpent. That would be inconsistent, and again, unless we're talking a piece of wood nailed to a tree. To me, that satisfies pretty much everything, and hopefully everyone, but you never know, right? Let's see what the first reference is. This beam right here. Okay, so this word is Zilon. And then just above that, it's a little bit different translation here. It says, where it says here, you shall not have any graven or molten image of your God. Moses, when he commanded, did so that he might reveal a type of Jesus. Moses makes a brazen serpent, places it upon a beam. Here it says, ye shall have neither graven nor molten image for your God, yet he makes one of himself to show a type of Jesus. Moses therefore makes a graven serpent and places it in honor and calls the people by a proclamation. And that is basically what it says, right? Moses kalkun ofin kai tithesin. Endoxos. So I guess if you're looking up at a serpent, right? If you're considering a serpent in an elevated position as one you need to look to in order to be saved, that's putting it in a position of honor, right? So we get in the Greek text here a term that basically involves honoring it, and then a term that involves putting it on a tree or a zilon, right? And what does this prefigure, everyone? Right? This is about the Messiah here. That's why Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, right? So when you've lifted up the Son of Man, it prefigures the Messiah, again, showing the connection also with these serpentine beings, right? The seraphim, right? Fiery flying serpents. Satan, of course, presented as a serpent in the garden, the original serpent in Revelation. So there's something there. And then, of course, you have this serpent here, right? So there's definitely an association with these spirit gods and serpents, which are often used together when the gods of this world represent themselves through their various peoples. All right, so I think here that the information is somewhat inconclusive, but it can be harmonized, as I said earlier, if maybe Jesus is viewed as bringing a piece of wood to a tree and being nailed to the tree. And so I wanted to present that information to you all here. And also the understanding that we need to have with respect to some of the quotations that don't really have a source that we know about, but that probably existed when this was written.